Hello viewers and welcome to the channel. My name is Joe, aka Rufio, and if this is your first time here, I guess welcome aboard. You should definitely consider hitting subscribe and the notification bell before we go any further and you realise how fucking garbage this content is. But if this is not your first time on the channel, welcome back. For today's video we're going to be deep diving once again into some more Warhammer 40K lore. And in particular we're going to be taking a look at the fearsome, ferocious, and absolutely terrifying Night Lords. Now we all already know the forces of the Chaos are absolute monstrosities to say the least, but these guys, they take things to another level. These guys were assholes before the heresy. But I digress, I'm getting away from things here. I'm going to stop waffling on. Let's get stuck in to the video. The Night Lords Legion are widely accepted as one of the most brutal and sadistic iterations of Chaos Space Marines. But it was not their falling into the hands of the Chaos Gods that caused them to be the cruel monstrosities that they are today. To understand why the Night Lords are the way they are, we need to go back in time and study the rise of their Primarch, the Night Haunter, Konrad Curze. Konrad Curze, like his Primarch brothers, was created at the hands of the Emperor of Mankind. Unfortunately for Konrad, when the Ruinous Powers allegedly used their influence over Erda, the Primarch's mother, to scatter the Primarchs across the galaxy, Konrad found himself on the hive world Nostromo. Living on Nostromo was a bleak existence at best, a planet shrouded in perpetual darkness due to the levels of pollution in the atmosphere. It also circled a dying star which didn't have enough light to penetrate the haze and reach the surface. And unless you were fucking wealthy, the concept of light was a foreign one at best. The planet's entire purpose was to, in effect, pump out adamantium. This being its chief export meant that it was covered in metalworks and chemical plants, which continued to pump out more and more toxic waste into the ecosystem. The vast majority of the planet's inhabitants were perpetually living in poverty at the best of times, and anybody who tried to break the mould, or was seen to be attempting to do so, would soon find themselves crushed at the hands of the rich who had no interest in giving up on their slice of the pie. This depressive existence meant that the suicide rate amongst those who existed on Nostromo was, unsurprisingly, very high, and those who did want to survive were forced to live in lives of crime, with the likes of murder, extortion and robbery being the everyday norm. And now that we've set the scene for Konrad's place to be raised, you can see why he was more or less doomed from the start, and this setting very much indicates how dreadful his life would begin, and how it would end. Konrad's earliest memory was plummeting from the skies in a sphere of light, plunging into the darkness of his new home. He crashed through the hive city of Nostromo, Quintus, the largest on the planet, and on his way through he destroyed a huge number of buildings and eventually smashed through the planet's surface, with his journey onto the planet ending somewhere close to the liquid core of the planet. The crater left behind was covered up and feared by the natives. Konrad's only means of escaping this pit to reach the surface are assumed to have been to swim through the molten metals, or perhaps instead his gestation capsule was forced up to the surface via volcanic vents within. There is one record that exists of his arrival, the Arcana Progentium, which made alleged details of how it happened. A glowing child form it was, crawled from the pit onto the broken street, hissing molten metal dripping from its limbs. It was a demon no less, with the body of an infant but the expression of an old man, its eyes black and cold as obsidian. Konrad's life would continue on this horrific trajectory. He was completely alone in his upbringing. He didn't enjoy the luxuries of having a family to take him in and protect him, nobody to look over and guide him on a positive path. Surviving on rodents and any animals he could find roaming the city streets. When there was no vermin to consume, he feasted on the bodies of the dead, a grim living at best. To make matters worse, he was riddled with visions of all the darkest possible outcomes for the future, monstrous nightmares that would wake and curse him throughout his entire life, a fact that would set the scene for his very end. For years he would live consumed by darkness, eventually deciding that carrying out justice was his only escape from this hellish existence. If he could make the unjust pay for their sins, Nostromo would be better for it. His way of showing this difference was to begin killing anybody who should cross his path, and starting his own to becoming a symbol of justice. On a world full of murderers and thugs, there was plenty for him to dish out this justice to, without any real need to go looking for it. The bodies of these sinners would be crucified, mutilated, and stuck to buildings, their flayed flesh draped from bridges and their severed heads spiked on railings. A clear message to those who chose this way of living. His actions spawned a name that followed the trail of the dead, the Night Haunter. A name that evoked a feeling of fear for those who might be his targets, and hope for those who wanted for a better world. Within a year he had ascended, eradicating almost all crime along the way, and become the one known as the Dark King, the very first absolute monarch of Nostromo. The Dark King, however, would rule with surprising levels of reason unless the word landed in his ears that there was an injustice. He would personally see to it that the perpetrator was taken care of, mutilating them and continuing to shovel untold levels of fear into the citizens and ensuring fewer still might test its resolve. The world, however, did begin to thrive in some balance. The once rich were terrified that the neighbours might go without, and worried of this falling into being seen as an injustice. This would ensure that they shared around their hoard. Eventually, however, the Emperor would arrive, and to no surprise, Curze had foreseen this in his dreams. Curze's ability to unite the planet, even under fear, had shown his ability to transform a once corrupt and rotten world into something far more palatable. The Emperor's Great Crusade eventually arrived close to the Nostroman star system, and when he arrived on Nostromo surrounded by an Imperial force, flanked by the Primarchs Rogel Dawn, Lorgar Aurelian, Ferrus Manus, and Fulgrim, he waltzed through the city of Nostromo Quintus, blinding many of the people who had never seen this kind of brilliant light that he emitted. Upon each Primarch introducing themselves, Curze would say nothing but would see a vision of their brutal demise. But this wasn't to be when the Emperor himself stepped forth. Curze suddenly found himself being bombarded by a vision so terrifying that he dropped to his knees and tried to claw his own eyes out, only to be stopped by the Emperor, whose hand upon his head was enough for the pain to die away and restore his sanity. Following a short exchange, Curze submitted to the Emperor's will, and from that moment, the 8th Legion was doomed, and Nostromo along with it. During the Great Crusade, Konrad quickly adapted to the teachings of the Imperium, largely under the guidance of Fulgrim, and once he was inducted as the leader of the 8th Legion, which was created from his genome, he would name them his Night Lords. Curze joined his brothers in countless campaigns of victory during the Great Crusade, but despite their endless positive displays, he continued to remain introverted, preferring instead the company of his own legion, the Night Lords, whom he shared this mentality of continually staring into the abyss. And this in turn drove those around him into considering the darkest notions of reality. The Night Lords, true to their Primarch's tendencies, were abhorrent and sadistic in their approach to achieving their goals. They had almost no human qualities, no humour, no joy, just sheer, unadulterated brutality. To fit this image, they were encouraged to adorn themselves with symbols on their armour that would inspire terror in those who looked upon them. Any who did not embrace them on their path to the Great Crusade would face the true horror of the Night Lords' unnecessarily monstrous tactics. The tidal wave of terror that came with the Night Lords and their ominous reputation that spread along with it found the Night Lords being used as a weapon of horror by the Emperor. The murmurs of their potential arrival in the area would be enough to force rebel star systems to settle their outstanding debts with the Imperium. And they might even consider doing some housekeeping along the way, that is, stopping crimes and legal activities in quick fashion and putting any suspected traitors and or mutants to the sword. The planets they found resistance from were met with skinning pits and untold carnage, which the Night Lords revelled in. The absence of Curze from Nostromo, however, began a cycle that would condemn the Night Lords, with the planet returning to the grim past that once again pumped through its veins. This same blood pumped through the warriors that it would offer up to the 8th Legion, increasing its blackened heart with each and every new recruit. Over time, Curze would come to despise his own warriors, recognising they had simply become a horde of the same murderers and thieves he hated, only now they were blessed with all the blessings of being a Space Marine, rewarded for being the unjust sinners he strove to eradicate from his very home. The Night Lords would be dispatched at the Emperor's will, used as a weapon of sheer monstrosity that would quickly lead to the pacification of their targets and bring into line planets that had already been taken by other Space Marine legions. Planetary governors would not dare to step out of line, and those who did found their planets obliterated for even the smallest of misdemeanors. Despite the obvious flaws in Curze's character, the Emperor did little that is known to quell the actions or to try to draw the Night Lord into a more reasonable level of behaviour, and the list of their atrocities continued to spiral out of control. And as it did, it would be inevitable that they would eventually succumb to the darkness that encircled them, circled in darkness much the same way as their home planet from which they came. The destruction of Nostromo set about a foreshadowing of what would come, and the planet slipping back into its grotesque ways had caught the ire of the Night Haunter one final time. Following a series of atrocities committed by the Legion, a quarrel broke out between Curze and Rogel Dawn, culminating in a fight which left Dawn severely wounded, and Curze's personal group of bodyguards diminished down to a single warrior. Curze would return to Nostromo with his Legion, and in doing so he aimed to fulfill a vision which he had held. This was brought to fruition by the Night Lords decimating Nostromo by opening their lance batteries into the crater in which Curze had arrived in his infancy. This was something that was witnessed by a few Imperial crafts who had happened to arrive just in time. Nostromo was no more, and with this symbolic defiance, he finally pacified the horrors of his homeworld. The fallout from this is disputed, with some sources stating that, much to Curze's surprise, the Legion was reprimanded. Curze argued that he'd simply brought the planet back into line, and other sources stated that no punishment was dished out at all, with the Emperor willing to overlook this, instead believing that unity was far more important for the long-term goal. The truth, however, is that ultimately Curze and his Legion felt relatively minor slaps on the wrist. He was essentially banished for a period of time and cut off from supplies, but all in all, mostly inconvenienced at worst. And by the time of the 31st millennium, he was recalled to the Loyalist fleet. As we begin to approach the events of the heresy which would settle the Night Lords as a traitor legion, we should once again discuss Curze's ability to see the events yet to come. Events that, no matter how hard he tried to manipulate them, would always point to an ominous ending for himself and for the Night Lord Legion, which pushed him even closer and closer towards insanity. And as the Great Crusade came towards its end, Curze was living on a razor's edge, ready to fall off into the abyss at any moment. He was a hollow shell of a powerful lord that he once was, and the soul of his legion would follow suit. By the time that the Horus Heresy would arrive, Curze was full, bitter and twisted in hatred as a result of the Emperor's rejection of the Night Lord's methods of protecting and extending the reach of the Imperium. When Horus Lupercal called upon him, he did not hesitate to join the rebellion. With the key moments of the heresy revealing Horus's plans, Curze would begin to unleash a new tour of terror. Indulging in his darkest and most furious needs, the Night Lords, in a moment of incredible irony, had become the traitorous bastards they had sought to bring to justice. Over time, Curze would have several run-ins with his brothers. Most notably, he repeatedly feuded with Lionel Johnson, and with it his Dark Angels, and most of their conflicts ended near fatally for both of them. The Night Lords and their Primarch would ultimately be cornered following an ambush by the Dark Angels, which saw a huge split with the Night Lords being scattered across the galaxy. Curze would board the Lion's ship and begin a cat-and-mouse chase with the Dark Angel's Primarch, eluding him long enough and eventually escaping the ship when it was forced to land on Macragge. Curze's escape would see him running around Macragge, causing rebellions and havoc wherever he went, until eventually he was caught and a brutal fight between the Primarchs broke out. The Lion emerged the victor, and when interrogated by his brother on why he'd become a traitor, Curze replied, "Why not?" He then went on a rant explaining that there was a monster in his head that he could not stop. Whilst the Lion could not bring himself to end Curze's life, instead he opted to beat him down, ripping off his backpack and breaking his spine across his knee, leaving the traitor Primarch paralysed before dragging him before Sanguinius and Guilliman to stand trial. The punishment for the crimes would ultimately see Curze placed into a stasis coffin under Sanguinius' orders and fired into the void of space. Throughout the heresy, Curze would float through space until eventually he was discovered by an Imperial salvage ship several years after the end of the heresy. An Imperial assassin was hidden amongst the crew and broke the coffin open. Curze, in his rude awakening, started butchering everybody on board, and this continued until only Curze, a single crewman, and the assassin remained alive. The assassin was able to tip off his temple as to Curze's location before he too was slain. Curze would keep the crewman as his personal slave, and he was eventually brought to his own grisly end later on. Curze returned to a Night Lord's fortress on Sagualsa, and finally rejoined his weakened legion. And it would be Sagualsa where he would ultimately meet the fate he had foreseen all along. The assassination was indeed carried out, and it's often surmised that he allowed it to take place as a form of vindication. At the time it took place, he acknowledged all of his crimes and abhorrent behaviour, but also stated that his inability to change his fate would prove that he had no control over what had taken place in the past. In knowing that the assassination would take place, he shared this information with his Night Lord Legion, but asked them not to pursue the assassin, something they disregarded once the event had come to pass. After the death of their Primarch, the Night Lords continued to act as they always had, specialists in inspiring terror to any who crossed their path. They accepted the chaos within, being drawn into its grasp. But they did worship their own twisted understanding of what justice was above anything else. Eventually the Night Lords would split and splinter into multiple infighting warbands. As is the nature of chaos, this means that the cohesion within the Legion, as with any other traitor Legion, is hard to continue to exist, and what remained of the Night Lords would eventually relocate to the Eye of Terror. By the time of the 41st millennium, the Legion was threadbare and had lost almost all of its potent threat. As to what the Night Lords had become, they're more or less hired mercenaries and elite shock troops for other forces of chaos. And almost every known raptor in the service of chaos originates from the Night Lord's remaining warriors. They've been known to act as pirates for the likes of Huron Blackheart, fighting alongside his Red Corsairs when called upon, and the War Master of Chaos Abaddon the Despoiler and his unifying banner of the Black Legion. While the Night Lords themselves, as a legion, are all but gone, the impact and echoes of their beliefs and practices continue to run through the remaining warriors' veins, and shaping the tactics of those who would hire them to their cause.